The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fading orange, casting long, mournful shadows across the quiet dignity of the cemetery. There, by a freshly turned grave, stood Frank Monroe, an 82-year-old man etched with the quiet resilience of a life fully lived. He wasn't just standing. He was a sentinel of sorrow, a figure woven into the fabric of the twilight, utterly absorbed in his private, aching goodbye to Evelyn, his wife of 45 years. The last mourners had long since departed, their footsteps fading into the heavy silence, leaving behind only the scent of wilted flowers and the crushing weight of absence. He had survived the raw brutality of war zones, endured the sterile chill of countless surgeries, and weathered 72 unforgiving winters, yet absolutely nothing, not a single hardship, had prepared him for the desolate void that now echoed in his soul. He wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. This ground, to him, wasn't just a patch of city property. It was sacred, hallowed by decades of shared love, a final sanctuary where their souls might still converse. Then the piercing, unwelcome intrusion. The stark blue and red pulse of police lights cut brutally through the cemetery fog, a jarring rupture in his sacred grief. A voice, sharp and devoid of empathy, shattered the stillness. "You're trespassing." Frank didn't move. He simply couldn't. His gaze remained fixed on Evelyn's name, etched forever in cold stone, the only reality that mattered. A young officer, perhaps barely out of the academy, approached, radiating an almost aggressive confidence. "License and registration, and get off the bike now, sir," she snapped, her hand already resting on her holstered weapon. James, his composure a testament to decades of disciplined calm, handed over his documents. His age, 82, seemed to fuel their condescension. "Don't you think you're a little too old to be riding a motorcycle?" one sneered, while the other scoffed at his rusty Harley. They subjected him to an unnecessary search, treating his quiet dignity as defiance, his wisdom as confusion. "You're resisting a lawful order," the officer accused when he simply sat down, his weary body heavy with grief. He tried to explain, his voice a low, cracked whisper. "I'm not resisting. I'm remembering." But they didn't care. The cold click of handcuffs echoed in the fading light, binding his trembling wrists. His mind, in a fleeting, desperate escape, drifted back to desert nights and the crunch of boots on sand. Yet this felt colder, meaner, less human. They pulled him, stumbling, his ancient joints protesting, misinterpreting his pain as resistance. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't angry. He was simply exhausted, a weariness born of a grief no one could possibly understand. It was a profound, painful misjudgment, a cruel injustice unfolding under the indifferent gaze of the twilight sky. Across the street, at his humble gas station, Marcus, a man forged by the grit of the Gulf War and hardened by 58 years of life, stood wiping down a fuel pump. His eyes, however, weren't on the mundane task, but drawn, compelled, to the unfolding injustice in the cemetery. He knew James Harris, not just as a regular customer for 15 years, always polite, always punctual with his payments, always ready with a kind word, but as a fellow veteran, a silent comrade. The sight of Frank, a man of quiet dignity, now in handcuffs, bewildered and small beside a police cruiser that idled like awaiting punishment, sent a slow, simmering anger boiling in Marcus's blood. And the young cop, barely out of the academy, puffed up with a false sense of control, only intensified his fury. This wasn't just some old man being humiliated. This was a brother, a veteran being disrespected. His grief trampled under the boots of ignorance. Without a second thought, without a shred of hesitation, Marcus grabbed the phone. His fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as he dialed the nearby military base at Fort Carson. "Hello, this is Marcus Williams," he stated, his voice tight with an urgency that conveyed the gravity of the situation. "I need to speak with an officer on duty, and it's urgent. We've got a fellow veteran being disrespected by local police. James Harris, 82 years old. I've known him for 15 years. He's an honest man, being humiliated in public just for riding his bike." The response on the other end of the line was immediate, electric. The officer's tone, initially professional, sharpened with an unmistakable authority upon hearing James's name. "Did you say James Harris?" "Hold on a second." A moment stretched, taut with anticipation, before the voice returned, now infused with an undeniable command. "Mr. Williams, keep your eyes on the situation. We're sending a unit right now. Do not let them do anything to Colonel Harris until we arrive." The word "colonel" hit Marcus like a physical blow, a revelation that sent a fresh surge of awe and dread through him. James, his quiet, unassuming friend, had never mentioned his rank. "I can't give you details over the phone," the officer continued, "but we'll be there in 15 minutes. The call ended, leaving Marcus with a pounding heart and a fierce, protective resolve. He stepped closer to the road, his gaze fixed across the street where the absurdity continued to unfold. Officer Johnson, oblivious to the storm brewing, was now attempting to force James into the patrol car for a psychiatric evaluation. "Mr. Harris," she stated, her voice edged with a dangerous certainty, "I'm going to need you to get in the vehicle. We're going to the hospital for an evaluation." James's calm, low voice cut through the tension, a quiet defiance that only fueled Johnson's frustration. "I'm not going." "What do you mean you're not going?" "This isn't a request, it's an order," she snapped. "Based on what law?" he countered, his eyes holding a familiar patience that had once trained hundreds of young soldiers. Johnson hesitated, caught in her own trap of poor judgment and an increasingly hostile public. James, for the first time, offered a small, almost invisible smile, the kind that comes from recognizing a well-crafted lie, a lie he'd heard from enemies far more dangerous. The crowd, sensing the imminent confrontation, held its breath. Far down the road, the deep roar of engines began to build, growing louder, closer. James Harris had no idea, but help, swift and absolute, was on its way. The escalating tension in the cemetery parking lot was brutally, definitively shattered by a deep, resonant roar of engines. It was the unmistakable sound of command, of purpose, of unyielding force. 12 Humvees, tearing around the bend, appeared like specters from the dust, their powerful forms kicking up plumes as they sped towards the scene in a perfectly synchronized, unassailable formation. They halted in a tight semicircle, strategically encircling the bewildered officers and the still, dignified figure of James Harris, a living monument to quiet endurance. 50 soldiers, their faces grim and resolute, spilled out of the vehicles, their very presence a palpable force that instantly dwarfed the local patrol. The air crackled with a new, undeniable authority. From the lead Humvee, an Army officer emerged. Captain George Farrell. At 55 years old with 22 years of active service, his bearing was sharp, his eyes keen, reflecting a lifetime of unwavering dedication. He walked with a determined, almost predatory stride, heading directly for James Harris, his gaze completely bypassing the confused local officers as if they were invisible. He stopped precisely 3 meters away, his posture snapping to rigid attention, and delivered a salute that crackled with an almost painful respect and unshakable authority. "Colonel Harris," he stated, the single word hanging in the air like a detonation, echoing with a weight that shook the very ground. Officer Johnson and Lopez exchanged panicked glances, their faces draining of all color. The word, the rank, the sheer gravity of the moment, it hit them like a physical blow, dismantling their flimsy authority. "Sir, we were informed there was some sort of misunderstanding here," Lopez stammered, attempting to regain control of a situation that had spiraled wildly, terrifyingly, out of their grasp. Farrell turned to the officers for the first time, his eyes cutting like honed blades, sharp and unforgiving. "Who dared to stop Colonel Harris?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that promised severe consequences. Johnson, desperate to salvage some semblance of her rapidly vanishing authority, began. "Officer Johnson, local police. We stopped this gentleman because this gentleman—" Farrell's voice rose, powerful and resonant, cutting her off mid-sentence. As he spoke, all 50 soldiers took a synchronized step forward, a sudden, instinctive, and utterly formidable show of unwavering support for their commander, their boots hitting the asphalt with a unified thud. "Captain," Johnson pleaded, her voice cracking, "I didn't know he was military." Farrell's gaze held hers, unwavering, searing. "This man served 3 tours in Vietnam," he began, his voice deepening with every word. "Carried out intelligence operations in the Gulf and Afghanistan, personally trained hundreds of U.S. Army officers, including myself. This man you stopped. He holds 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts with 4 oak leaf clusters, and a Distinguished Service Cross. Colonel Harris is considered a living legend in the United States Armed Forces. Soldiers from all over the country came to train under him." He then turned his full, searing attention back to Johnson, his voice dropping to a chillingly calm tone. "Officer, you disrespected a decorated war hero who gave 60 years of his life in service to your country." Lopez tried one last, desperate attempt to interject. "We were just doing our job." But Farrell's voice thundered, cutting him off with the force of a tidal wave. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate an old man in public." The shift in the crowd was immediate and profound, a collective gasp of realization. Cell phones were still recording, but now the earlier mockery and judgmental whispers had completely evaporated, replaced by palpable reverence, not ridicule. Whispers of "poor guy, that was awful," and "that officer really crossed the line," swept through the gathering, laced with guilt and dawning understanding. Johnson, her face pale, her composure shattered, stepped closer to James Harris, her gaze now filled with a desperate apology. "Sir. Colonel Harris. Sorry. I didn't know." James Harris, the quiet legend, looked at her with the same patience he had shown countless young recruits decades ago, a quiet wisdom shining in his eyes, untouched by the chaos around them. "Officer Johnson," he offered, his voice calm and steady, a gentle balm amidst the storm. "May I offer you some advice?" She nodded, desperate for any shred of guidance. "Yes, sir." His words, simple yet profound, resonated not just for her, but for every eye and ear witnessing this powerful scene, a timeless truth etched into the very air. Never judge someone by their appearance. You have no idea what battles they fought, what scars they carry inside. The lesson hung heavy, undeniable, and universally applicable, piercing the superficiality that had led to such a grave misjudgment. Officer Johnson, utterly humbled and remorseful, could only stand there, a statue of professional composure finally shattered by the overwhelming weight of her profound misjudgment. Her earlier arrogance had collided head-on with undeniable valor, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. Her apology to Colonel Harris, though belated and delivered through trembling lips, was undeniably sincere, a raw admission that she hadn't seen beyond the surface, hadn't understood the immeasurable depth of the man standing calmly before her. Back at the local police station, the news of the incident had already reached Sheriff Smith, a seasoned veteran of 15 years in office. His phone call with Captain Farrell from Fort Carson was brief but impactful. "Sheriff Smith, Captain Farrell, Fort Carson. We need to talk about the incident this morning." Smith already knew. He'd spoken to a visibly shaken Johnson and Lopez. When he tentatively asked about the procedure for handling such a grave error, Captain Farrell's response was firm and unyielding. Colonel Harris sought no revenge, no lawsuits, no ruined careers. But the military institution, Farrell stated with an unwavering resolve, simply cannot accept our veterans being treated this way. The message landed with immense weight, heavy with unspoken consequences. Smith, a man who understood the intricate dance of political repercussions and institutional pressure, knew this transcended a mere local precinct incident. When asked for a suggestion, Farrell proposed a training program, carefully developed in partnership with the base. "Your officers will visit our base to understand what it truly means to serve this country," he explained, his voice brooking no argument. "It'll be done, Captain," Smith affirmed, knowing this wasn't just a suggestion, but an imperative. A week later, Sheriff Smith gathered all his officers for an emergency meeting, the tension in the room thick and palpable. "Everyone," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his decision, Starting today, we're implementing a new protocol for field encounters, and all of you will be attending training at the military base. Ava Johnson, still visibly nervous but radiating a new kind of quiet determination, stood up. "Colleagues," she began, her voice soft but clear, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "Last week I made a serious mistake. I disrespected a man who deserves, our deepest admiration. But I learned something more important than procedures and regulations. I learned about human dignity." She looked around at her fellow officers, her gaze unwavering, imbued with a newfound clarity. "Every person we stop on the street carries a story. This is about treating everyone, especially the elderly, with basic respect. Asking before assuming. Listening before judging." The seeds of true redemption were being sown, transforming a moment of profound misjudgment into a powerful, lasting lesson for an entire department, a solemn vow to serve with empathy, not just authority. Days later, Officer Ava Johnson found herself driving down Highway 340. Her heart still thrumming with the quiet humility of her recent lessons. She pulled up to a simple but impeccably kept property. A white-painted wooden house, a porch adorned with rocking chairs, and a vibrant garden bursting with colorful flowers. A familiar John Deere tractor sat beside the barn, a silent sentinel, and beneath it, Colonel Harris was at work, a grease-stained coverall his current uniform, his hands deftly tackling a hydraulic system. His old Harley rested in the shade of a large tree, a testament to enduring spirit. As Johnson approached, her patrol car now an almost apologetic presence, Colonel Harris slid out from under the tractor, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Officer Johnson, can I help you?" he asked, his voice as calm and steady as the deep rumble of his bike. "Sir, I came to talk if that's all right with you," she replied, her voice soft, imbued with a newfound respect. "Want some coffee?" "Just made a fresh pot inside," he offered, leading her into his modest yet welcoming kitchen. They sat at an old wooden table, two blue ceramic mugs steaming gently between them. "Officer, may I ask you a few questions?" he began, a gentle smile playing on his lips, his gaze direct yet kind. Johnson, taken aback by the shift in roles, nodded. "Of course. Why did you become a police officer?" he inquired. "I wanted to help people. Make a difference in the community." "How many accidents caused by elderly drivers have you responded to?" he continued, his gaze unwavering. Johnson hesitated, the truth stark and immediate. "Very few, actually. Most of the accidents I see are caused by younger drivers. Drunk, speeding, texting." Harris gave a soft, knowing smile, a quiet challenge in his eyes. "Then why did you assume I was the problem?" The question hung in the air, potent and unanswerable, leaving Johnson without a response. The truth, stark and painful, now lay bare. Harris stood, walking to the window, his gaze sweeping over his cows grazing peacefully in the pasture, a scene of timeless tranquility. "Respect isn't earned just by a uniform or a rank," he said, his voice a quiet sermon, his wisdom resonating deeply. "It's earned by how you treat others, no matter their age." Johnson looked out the window at the old Harley, a sudden, profound realization washing over her. Harris had been riding that bike longer than she'd been alive. That 1970 Harley-Davidson, still making its distinctive noise, still looking old and rusty, still worked. It still got Harris where he needed to go. That motorcycle still had roads to travel. And so, she understood with a new, quiet certainty, did Colonel Harris. And in a hopeful, echoing whisper in her soul, so do all of us. The story, once a local incident, had exploded, footage from the cemetery going viral within 48 hours. News anchors argued over policy, talk shows debated police training. But to Frank, none of that truly mattered. He cared that people had been reminded what respect truly looked like. The officer who tasered him faced an immediate internal review. Her body cam footage was scrutinized, witnesses gave statements, veterans sent emails. The police department issued a public apology and quietly placed the officer on administrative leave. But Frank never asked for punishment, only understanding. New protocols were swiftly introduced. Officers were now required to call a supervisor before arresting anyone over 65 for a nonviolent infraction. Training was revised, and crisis counselors were added to shift rotations. For Frank, however, the real reform had already happened the moment 7 young men proved that service doesn't expire with age or rank. Letters poured into Frank's mailbox, from veterans, from strangers, from widows and children and fellow Marines. Some were short. "You reminded me of my dad." Others told poignant stories of lost spouses, of folded flags, of silent grief no one had noticed until now. He read every single one, keeping them all in a box beside Evelyn's nightstand, and every morning, he would read one aloud to her grave. The Marines visited again, unannounced, 2 weeks later. No cameras, no news, just brothers returning to see a man they now called family. They brought coffee, a folded flag, and silence. Tommy placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. No words needed. Frank smiled, smaller this time but stronger. They stayed for an hour, then saluted him before heading back through the gates, leaving nothing behind but their footsteps and a profound sense of peace. Frank resumed his routine, visiting Evelyn twice a week, always dressed sharp. Some days he brought flowers, on others he brought stories. And when people passed by, they recognized him, not from the news, but from how gently he knelt by that stone. Children would wave, veterans would nod. He had become something more than a man who was wronged. He had become a symbol of what's right. The community had changed. The cemetery grounds were no longer just quiet. They were watched, maintained, respected. Young officers who patrolled there now greeted visitors with more than protocol, with presence, with genuine respect. Some had even heard of Frank Monroe before ever meeting him, and when they finally did, they called him Sir. Frank never asked to be a symbol. He just wanted to keep a promise. The one he made at war, the one he made at his wedding, the one he made at the side of Evelyn's hospital bed when her hands grew cold and her voice began to fade. "Don't let me be alone." And he didn't. Not that day. Not ever. He kept showing up because love, like service, isn't just declared. It's lived through pain, through silence, through misunderstanding, through storms. And when others forget, it's the quiet ones who remember. The ones who still stand when no one is watching. The ones who stay after the gates are locked. Frank didn't need a parade. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted to finish his goodbye. The kind of goodbye that can't be rushed or scripted. The kind that takes everything you have and gives something back, something lasting, something real. Evelyn's grave became a landmark, not because of her name, but because of what happened beside it, because of who knelt there, because of who stood, and because the world saw what honor looks like when it's wrapped in a blue suit and a trembling hand. Months passed. The story faded from the news, as they always do. But in homes across the country, people remembered. And in one small town, an old man with a cane and a medal kept walking the same path, week after week, with a heart still full of words and a pouch still tucked inside his coat. Frank knew he wouldn't have many more years to make the trip. His body was slower, his steps shorter, but each one still mattered because every step said, "I'm still here and she still matters." That, to him, was everything. That was the oath no uniform could revoke. One morning, he left a final letter, addressed not to the Marines, not to the police, but to whoever might kneel there next. It read simply, "If you ever feel forgotten, stand anyway. You're never truly alone." He sealed it, placed it under a stone, and walked away. No trumpets played, no headlines ran. But as he reached the gates, a soft breeze swept through the trees, and somewhere, he thought, he heard her voice again, laughing, whispering, proud. And for the first time in a long time, Frank Monroe smiled without crying. Service ends. Honor does not.